Hello everyone, tonight I've got 3 special scary stories for all of you. So before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Creepy Sinister, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. This happened during my freshman year finals week. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. I was living in a small, cramped dorm room on the 3rd floor of an old brick building at a university in Ohio. It was one of those classic campus buildings that looked beautiful on the outside but felt decaying and heavy on the inside. The radiators hissed constantly, and the hallways always smelled like a mix of old books and damp concrete. Being my first year away from home, I struggled a lot with homesickness and the crushing pressure of my classes. To make the space feel more like home, I decided to create a large photo collage right above my bed. I didn't have much money, so I went down to the basement laundry room where students often left unwanted items in a free box near the dryers. That basement was a pretty creepy place on its own, with low ceilings and exposed pipes that dripped mystery liquid into puddles on the floor. In the corner of that room, I found a large, heavy wooden frame with a corkboard backing. It was dusty and had a slight smell of cedar, but it was perfect for what I needed. I carried the frame back up to my room, wiped it down with some damp paper towels, and started pinning up my memories. I had photos of my parents at our last 4th of July barbecue, my little sister at her graduation, and my golden retriever, Cooper, sitting on the porch. I even included some Polaroids I had taken with my new friends from the floor. By the time I was finished, the collage was a crowded, colorful map of everyone I loved. It made the cold, sterile dorm room feel a lot more lived in and safe. For the first few weeks having the photos, there was a huge comfort. Every morning when I woke up, I'd see my mom smile or my friends laughing, and it gave me the motivation to get through my lectures. But as the semester dragged on and the nights got longer, the atmosphere in the room started to change. It was late November, and the sun was setting around 5 p.m. every day, leaving the campus in a gray, depressing shadow. I started spending more time in my room studying for finals, often staying up until the early hours of the morning. The first time I noticed something strange was around 2:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. I had been staring at a chemistry textbook for 3 hours straight, and my eyes were starting to blur. I leaned back in my chair and glanced up at the collage to clear my head. My eyes landed on a photo of my sister standing in our driveway back home. She was supposed to be looking at the camera with a wide, bright smile, but something felt off. Her head seemed tilted at a slightly sharper angle than I remembered, and her eyes didn't seem to be looking at the lens anymore. I rubbed my eyes and chalked it up to exhaustion in the dim light of my desk lamp. I figured the shadows were just playing tricks on my mind, so I climbed into bed and tried to sleep. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the room was crowded. It was a very specific sensation, like being in a small elevator with several other people. I kept looking at the dark shapes of the photos above me, but eventually I drifted off into a restless sleep. A few days later, the feeling intensified. I came back from a late shift at the campus library around 11:45 p.m. and flipped on the overhead light. As the fluorescent bulb flickered to life, I glanced at the collage. In the center was a photo of my dog, Cooper, sitting on our front porch. I knew that photo by heart because it was my favorite one I had ever taken. In the original picture, Cooper was looking directly at me, his tongue hanging out in a happy pant. Now Cooper's head was turned completely to the side, looking toward the edge of the photo frame. It was physically impossible for a printed photograph to change, yet the image was undeniably different. My heart started to beat a little faster as I moved closer to inspect the print. I touched the glossy surface of the photo, half expecting it to feel wet or different, but it just felt like standard photo paper. I pulled the pin out and held the photo right under my desk lamp to see it better. Cooper wasn't just looking away, he looked terrified. His ears were pinned back against his head and his eyes were wide, showing the whites in a way he only did during bad thunderstorms. He was staring at something that was just barely visible in the corner of the image, a dark, blurry shape that looked like a hand gripping the edge of our porch railing. I felt a cold chill run down my spine because I knew for a fact that hand hadn't been in the original photo. I had taken that picture myself, and the porch had been completely empty. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, just staring at the dog's frozen expression. I tried to tell myself that I was having some kind of mental breakdown from the stress of finals. Maybe I was hallucinating or my brain was distorting my memories of the photos. I decided to take the photo of Cooper down and put it in my desk drawer, thinking that if I couldn't see it, I wouldn't worry about it. I went to bed that night with the light on, but I still felt those invisible eyes watching me from the remaining pictures. Next morning, I went down to the basement laundry room to do a load of whites. I was hopping to run into the building janitor, an older guy named Arthur who had worked there for decades. I found him near the boiler room, leaning on a mop and staring at the floor. I tried to act casual and asked him if anyone had ever complained about weird things happening in the rooms on the third floor. He looked at me with tired, gray eyes and asked if I was the one who took the frame from the free box. When I told him I was, his expression shifted from tired to genuinely concerned. He told me that the frame had belonged to a student who lived in my room about 10 years ago. According to Arthur, the student had become obsessed with the idea that his photos were changing, eventually claiming that the people in them were trying to climb out. He had been found in the basement one night, staring at a blank wall and refusing to speak. The frame had been sitting in the storage room ever since, until someone had finally decided to put it in the box. I didn't want to believe him, but the way he looked at me made my stomach turn. He told me I should probably get rid of it, but I was a stubborn 19-year-old who didn't want to admit I was scared. I went back to my room and tried to focus on my history paper, but the silence of the room felt heavy and suffocating. Every time I turned my back to the collage, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. It felt like a dozen pairs of eyes were boring into my skull. By Friday, things had reached a breaking point. I had stayed up until 3:30 a.m. writing my final essay. The room was silent except for the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. I finally finished the last paragraph and let out a long sigh of relief. As I reached over to save the file, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. It was a quick, fluid motion coming from the wall above my bed. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it actually hurt. I slowly turned my head to look at the collage. The photos were no longer just static images. In a large group photo of my high school friends, everyone was standing perfectly still, but they were all looking directly at me. Their faces were distorted, their smiles stretched too wide, showing far too many teeth. In the background of the photo, which should have been our high school football field, there was now a dark, cramped room that looked exactly like the basement laundry room of my dorm. Then I saw the most terrifying thing of all. In a small Polaroid that was supposed to be a selfie of me and my roommate, I wasn't there anymore. My roommate was still in the frame, but he was backed into a corner, looking at the empty space beside him with a look of pure horror. In the spot where I should have been standing, there was only a dark, blurry shadow. I realized with a jolt of terror that the shadow was shaped exactly like the person currently sitting at my desk. I jumped up from my chair and backed away until I hit the door. My eyes were locked on the collage, and that's when I saw the photos actually breathe. The paper seemed to rise and fall in a slow, rhythmic motion as if the wall itself was inhaling and exhaling. The people in the photos began to blink. They weren't moving like a video, it was more like a series of rapid still frames. 1 second their eyes were open, the next they were closed, and the next they were looking at a different part of my room. The most chilling part was that they were all slowly moving toward the edges of their respective photo prints. It looked like they were trying to find a way to cross over from one photo to the next. My sister's hand reached out from her picture and appeared in the corner of the photo next to it, which showed my parents. My parents weren't looking at her. They were looking at the ceiling of their photo, where a dark pair of legs was dangling down from the frame above them. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the edge of the wooden frame and ripped it off the wall. The pins held tight for a second before snapping, and the whole thing came crashing down onto my bed. I expected the movement to stop once the frame was down, but I could hear a faint, wet scratching sound coming from underneath the glass. It sounded like dozens of tiny fingernails clawing at a hard surface. I didn't even pack a bag. I just grabbed my phone and my coat and ran out of the room. I spent the rest of the night in the 24-hour student lounge, surrounded by other students who were also pulling all-nighters. The bright lights and the sound of people talking made me feel a little safer, but I couldn't stop shaking. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those distorted smiles and those blinking, paper-thin eyes. I waited until the sun came up at 7:15 a.m. before I worked up the courage to go back to my room to get my things. When I walked back in, the room was freezing cold. The radiator had stopped hissing and the air felt thin. The frame was still lying face down on my bed. I didn't want to look at it, but I knew I couldn't leave it there. I grabbed a thick trash bag from under the sink, and without looking at the front of the frame, I slid it inside and taped it shut. I carried it down to the basement, but I didn't put it back in the free box. I took it all the way out to the heavy steel dumpster behind the building and threw it inside. I finished my finals and went home for winter break that same afternoon. Being back in my parents' house was a relief, but the fear didn't completely go away. I found myself avoiding the family photo albums and looking away whenever I passed a mirror or a framed picture in the hallway. My mom asked me why I hadn't brought any photos back from my dorm, and I just told her that I wanted to start fresh for the next semester. I never told her about the frame or the things I saw inside it. A few days before I was supposed to head back to school for the spring semester, I was looking through some digital photos on my laptop. I came across the original picture of Cooper on the porch. I hesitated before opening it, my mouse hovering over the file. When I finally clicked, my heart stopped. The photo was exactly how I remembered it. Cooper was happy looking at the camera and the porch was empty. But then I noticed something in the very bottom corner of the digital image. There was a small, blurry reflection in the glass of the storm door behind the dog. It was hard to make out, but if I zoomed in all the way, I could see a person standing in the yard taking the picture. It was me, holding my old camera. But standing right behind me, almost blending into my shadow, was a tall, pale figure with no face. It was holding a large, wooden frame around my head, as if it were capturing me in a portrait of its own. I deleted the photo immediately and shut my laptop, but the image is burned into my mind. I moved to a different dorm building for the second semester, and I don't put anything on my walls anymore. I prefer the bare, white paint and the empty space. Sometimes, when the room is quiet at night, I think I hear a faint scratching sound coming from inside the walls. I try to tell myself it's just mice or the building settling, but I know better than that now. I've realized that some things aren't meant to be captured or framed. Sometimes, when you spend too much time looking at a memory, the memory starts looking back at you. I still have nightmares about that basement and the heavy smell of cedar. I often wonder if the next person who found that frame in the dumpster is seeing the same things I did. Or worse, I wonder if they're looking at a photo of a college kid sitting at a desk looking terrified and wondering why he's trying to climb out of the frame. Story 2. Back in the fall of my sophomore year, when I worked at the campus botanical greenhouse, I worked the late hours. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a trespasser or a broken heater. I was wrong. My name is Raphael, and at the time I was a biology major at a mid-sized university in Pennsylvania. I needed the extra money, and when Professor Sterling offered me a position as his research assistant for a private project, I jumped at the chance. It paid way better than the cafeteria or the library, and I figured it would be a quiet, easy way to spend my evenings. The project was a bit unusual, even for a botanist. Sterling was obsessed with what he called the eternal bloom. He was creating this massive, floor-to-ceiling decorative wall collage made entirely of pressed plants from all over the world. But these weren't just any plants. He had sourced rare, exotic specimens that were supposedly hard to preserve. My job was to stay in the greenhouse after the public hours ended and help him with the pressing process. The greenhouse was an old Victorian-style building made mostly of glass and rusted iron. During the day it was beautiful, but at night it felt like a completely different world. The lights were kept dim to protect some of the more sensitive species, leaving most of the long aisles in deep shadow. I would usually arrive around 9 p.m. and stay until the early morning hours. Most nights I was completely alone because Sterling would leave after giving me my instructions for the shift. The air inside was always thick and heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting vegetation. It was the kind of humidity that made your clothes stick to your skin within minutes of walking through the door. I spent my first few nights sitting at a long wooden workbench in the back of the facility. I had to carefully lay out leaves, vines, and flowers between sheets of heavy blotting paper and then tighten them down into large wooden presses. It was tedious work, but it was peaceful enough at first. Around the second week of the job, I started to feel a bit uneasy. It's hard to describe, but I always felt like I was being watched from the dense foliage behind me. The greenhouse was filled with massive ferns and tropical trees that reached all the way to the glass ceiling. When the wind blew outside, the shadows of the branches would dance across the floor like long, reaching fingers. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination and the lack of sleep getting to me. One night around 11:15 p.m., I was working on a particularly large specimen of a rare jungle vine. The greenhouse was silent, except for the occasional hum of the misting system. Suddenly I heard a soft rustling sound coming from the area where the wall collage was being assembled. It didn't sound like a breeze or a small animal. It sounded rhythmic, almost like a slow, deep breath being drawn through dry paper. I stopped what I was doing and listened intently. The sound lasted for about 30 seconds before fading away into the silence. I stood up and walked over to the collage area with my flashlight. The wall was about 10 feet tall and covered in hundreds of pressed leaves, all arranged in intricate swirling patterns. Everything looked normal, but the air around the wall felt significantly colder than the rest of the greenhouse. I checked the nearby vents, but they were all closed. I went back to my desk and tried to focus, but the feeling of dread was starting to settle in my stomach. A few hours later, at 1:45 a.m., I heard the rustling again. This time it was louder and more frantic. It sounded like someone was running their hands across the pressed leaves, or like the leaves themselves were shifting against the wood. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. The greenhouse was as still as a tomb. The next day I mentioned the noises to Professor Sterling. He was a thin, pale man who didn't talk much, and when he did, he usually kept his eyes on his plants. When I told him about the rustling and the breathing sounds, he didn't seem surprised or worried. He just gave me a small, unsettling smile and said that the plants were settling into their new home. He told me that life doesn't just disappear when a plant is pressed, it just changes form. I didn't really know what to make of that, but I needed the money, so I didn't push it. Things stayed relatively quiet for the next few nights, but the atmosphere in the greenhouse continued to darken. I started noticing small things that felt out of place. My pruning shears would be moved from one end of the bench to the other when I wasn't looking. The blotting paper would sometimes be damp even though I hadn't used any water near it. and every time I walked past the eternal bloom wall, I felt a strange, tingling sensation on the back of my neck. On a Tuesday night around 2:30 a.m., I was cleaning up my station when I noticed something truly bizarre. I was looking at a frame I had finished the night before. It contained several large, heart-shaped leaves that I had carefully centered, but now they were shifted to the left, and one of the leaves looked like it had been torn by something sharp. I knew for a fact that I had tightened the press down as hard as I could. There was no way those leaves should have moved. I decided to take a break and walk around the greenhouse to clear my head. As I walked down the narrow paths between the planter beds, I realized that the greenhouse felt even more crowded than usual. The plants seemed to be leaning into the aisles, their broad leaves brushing against my shoulders as I passed. I reached the far end of the building where the old storage shed was located. That's when I saw a figure standing near the entrance to the tropical ward. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I froze and shone my flashlight toward the person, thinking it was a security guard or a student who had broken in. The light hit a tall, thin shape, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a cluster of tall, woody vines that had grown together in a way that looked remarkably human. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, laughing at how jumpy I was becoming. But then the figure moved. It wasn't a sudden movement, but a slow, fluid sway that didn't match the direction of the overhead fans. I didn't wait around to see more. I turned around and headed straight back to the workbench, keeping my head down and focusing on the floor. I checked the time on my phone. It was 3:12 a.m. I only had about 2 hours left in my shift, and I was counting down every single minute. The rustling sound started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from everywhere. It sounded like the entire greenhouse was whispering. I could hear the dry scraping of leaves against glass, the creaking of stems, and that horrible rhythmic breathing sound. It was louder now, more persistent, like something was struggling to get oxygen. I sat at my bench, gripping the edge of the wood, trying to convince myself that it was just the building's old ventilation system. I decided I couldn't stay in there any longer. I started packing my bag, not caring if I left the project unfinished. As I was grabbing my keys, I felt a cold draft hit the back of my legs. I turned around and saw that the heavy wooden door to the greenhouse was standing wide open. I knew I had locked it when I came in. The cool night air was rushing in, clashing with the humid heat of the interior and creating a thick mist that swirled around my feet. I walked toward the door, wanting nothing more than to be outside in the parking lot, but as I passed the eternal bloom wall, I stopped dead in my tracks. My flashlight beam hit the center of the collage, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. The wall had changed. The intricate patterns of leaves and vines had been rearranged. They were no longer in the swirling designs the professor had created. Instead, they were forming shapes. I stepped closer, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the light steady. In the center of the wall, where there had once been a rare orchid, there were now several thin brown stems. They had been bent and pressed into the wood in a very specific way. My eyes scanned the stems and my heart dropped. The stems were shaped into letters. They were crude and jagged, but they were unmistakable. They spelled out my name, Rafael. I stared at the wall in total disbelief. I thought maybe it was a sick joke played by the professor, but there was no way he could have done this while I was in the room. I had been less than 20 feet away the entire night. The letters looked like they had grown out of the wall itself, the dried plant matter fused into the wood. Beneath my name, more leaves were shifting. I watched in horror as a small, withered vine slowly dragged itself across the surface, as if it were being moved by invisible hands. The breathing sound reached a fever pitch. It was no longer a soft rustle. It was a wet, raspy gasp that seemed to be coming from inside the wall. The leaves on the collage began to vibrate, their dried edges clicking together like teeth. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my hand. I looked down and saw that a thin green tendril had reached out from a nearby hanging pot and wrapped itself tightly around my wrist. It was squeezing so hard that my skin was turning purple. I let out a muffled yell and yanked my arm away, tearing the vine from the pot. I didn't look back. I bolted for the open door, stumbling through the mist and into the cool Pennsylvania night. I ran all the way to my car, my lungs burning, and I didn't stop until I was safely locked inside. I sat there for a long time, watching the dark silhouette of the greenhouse against the moonlit sky. It looked perfectly still, but I knew what was happening inside those glass walls. I never went back to that job. I didn't even go back to the biology department to collect my final paycheck. I sent a short email to Professor Sterling saying that I had a family emergency and had to quit immediately. He never replied, which in a way was even scarier than if he had been angry. I avoided that part of campus for the rest of the semester, taking the long way around just so I wouldn't have to see the greenhouse. A few months later, I ran into another student who had taken the job after me. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous twitch in his hands. I asked him how the Eternal Bloom project was going. He looked at me with a hollow expression and said that the professor had finally finished the wall. He told me the collage was beautiful, but that he had to quit because he couldn't stand the smell. He said the greenhouse didn't smell like plants anymore. When I asked him what it smelled like, he hesitated for a long time. He said it smelled like an old attic mixed with something metallic, like blood. He also mentioned that the professor had added a new section to the wall, a collection of personal artifacts that were being pressed alongside the plants. He didn't know what they were, but he said they looked like small scraps of clothing and locks of hair. I still have nightmares about that greenhouse. In my dreams, I'm back at that workbench, and the humidity is so thick I can't breathe. I look up at the eternal bloom wall, and I see my name again, but this time it's not just spelled out in stems. My own skin is being pressed into the wood, my veins turning into vines, and my breath becoming the rustling sound that haunts the silence of the night. To this day, I can't have plants in my apartment. Every time I see a pressed flower in a book or a decorative leaf on a wall, I feel that same cold tingle on the back of my neck. I try to tell myself that plants are just unthinking, unfeeling organisms, but I know better. I know that something in that greenhouse was hungry, and I know that it was waiting for me to become a permanent part of its collection. The scariest part isn't what happened that night, though. It's what I found a year later in the school newspaper. There was a small article about Professor Sterling retiring early and moving away. It included a photo of him standing in front of the finished wall collage. I zoomed in on the photo as much as I could, focusing on the spot where my name had been. My name was gone, replaced by a dense cluster of black moss, but right next to it, I saw something that made me go cold. There was a new name being formed by the leaves, and it was the name of the student I had talked to just weeks before. Story 3. It was the first late-night audio mixing session I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. My name is Caleb Thompson, and at the time I was a sophomore at a mid-sized state university in Ohio. I had a pretty standard work-study job at the campus radio station, WKL. It wasn't a high-pressure gig, especially since most people listen to podcasts or Spotify these days, but the station still had a loyal following of local night owls and sleep-deprived students. My job was mostly technical, which meant staying late into the night to edit segments, clean up audio files, and prepare the automated playlist for the following day. The radio station was located in the basement of the oldest building on campus, an ivy-covered brick structure called Miller Hall. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a building built in the early 1900s. It was full of narrow, dimly lit hallways, exposed pipes that hissed at random intervals, and a heavy, damp smell that never seemed to go away. The studio itself was a small, soundproof booth tucked into the very back of the lower level. It was a tiny room lined with thick, gray acoustic foam, and filled with glowing monitors and a large, outdated mixing board. On this particular night, my supervisor had asked me to create a special history of the campus segment. He wanted a long, ambient audio collage using old broadcasts from the station's archives, stretching all the way back to the 1950s. The goal was to mix these old voices with modern lo-fi beats to create something relaxing for the students to listen to while they studied for finals. I had a massive hard drive filled with digitized clips of old news reports, weather updates, and student interviews from decades ago. It was about 11:45 p.m. when I finally settled into the booth and put on my heavy, over-ear headphones. The rest of the building was completely empty, and the silence of the basement was heavy. Once those headphones were on, though, I was in my own world. I started by dragging several old clips into the editing software. Most of them were harmless enough, featuring students talking about campus protests in the 70s or old football games. The audio quality was grainy and full of that warm, rhythmic static you only get from old magnetic tape. By 1:15 a.m., I was deep into the process. The booth was dark, save for the blue glow of my dual monitors and the tiny green lights on the mixing board. I was working on a section of the collage that involved a lot of dead air transitions, those brief moments of silence between tracks that I wanted to fill with subtle atmospheric hums. I was wearing my headphones tight, listening for any unwanted pops or clicks in the background of the old recordings. That's when I heard the first glitch. It was a very short sound, maybe less than half a second long. It sounded like a sharp intake of breath, but it didn't match the tone or the static profile of the 1960s interview I was currently editing. I paused the playback and scrolled back through the waveform on the screen. I played the section again, staring at the jagged green lines of the audio file. There was nothing there. The line was flat, indicating total silence. I figured I was just tired, and my brain was starting to play tricks on me. I kept working, but a few minutes later it happened again. This time it wasn't a breath, it was a syllable. It sounded like the letter S, drawn out and hissed right into my left ear. I actually jumped in my seat, nearly knocking over my lukewarm coffee. I ripped the headphones off and looked around the tiny booth. The heavy soundproof door was closed and locked from the inside. There was nobody else in the room, and the security camera in the corner showed the hallway outside was completely still and empty. I sat there for a moment, trying to slow my heart rate down. I told myself that the acoustic foam sometimes played tricks with the air pressure in the room. I put the headphones back on, but I kept the volume lower this time. I decided to move on to a different folder of audio files to clear my head. This folder contained clips of my own voice that I had recorded earlier that week for the station's station IDs. You know the ones. You're listening to WKL, your home for campus news. As I began dragging my own voice clips into the timeline, the software started acting strangely. The playhead would skip or jump to different sections of the project without me touching the mouse. I tried to close the program and restart it, thinking it was just a memory leak in the computer, but the close button wouldn't respond. Instead, the software began to play the audio collage on its own. It started slowly, just a low hum of static from the archives, but then it began to pull in pieces of my own recorded voice. At first, it just sounded like a messy, accidental mix, but then I realized the clips of my voice were being sliced and rearranged at an impossible speed. The software was taking individual phonemes, the smallest building blocks of speech, and stitching them together to form new words. My own voice, which I had recorded just days ago, began to speak to me through the headphones. It said my name. It didn't sound like a recording anymore. It sounded like I was standing right behind myself, whispering into the microphone. Caleb, the voice said. The tone was flat and mechanical, but the timbre was unmistakably mine. I stared at the screen in total shock. I wasn't even touching the keyboard. The software was working on its own, moving files around and applying filters in real time. The green waveforms on the screen were dancing and shifting into shapes that didn't look like speech patterns at all. They looked like jagged teeth. I reached for the power cable under the desk, wanting to just shut the whole thing down, but before I could pull it, the audio changed again. The collage of old voices from the archives began to join in. A weather reporter from 1954, a basketball announcer from 1982, and a girl talking about a bake sale in the 90s all started speaking at once. They were all using the same sliced-up method to form words that shouldn't have been in their original recordings. "Don't leave the booth," the voices said in a chilling, multi-layered harmony. It sounded like a choir made of ghosts and static. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand straight up. I lunged for the door handle, but it felt like it was stuck. The electronic lock, which usually clicked open with a simple turn, wouldn't budge. It felt like someone was holding it from the other side, though I knew the hallway was empty. I turned back to the monitors and my heart nearly stopped. The dead air section I had been working on was now a solid block of white on the screen. The volume in my headphones began to climb, even though I was frantically turning the physical knob on the mixing board all the way down. The sound was getting louder and louder, a screeching roar of 1,000 voices all trying to speak over each other. And through the noise, I could hear the entity, or whatever it was, practicing. It was mimicking the sounds of the booth. It made the sound of my chair creaking. It made the sound of my own heavy breathing. Then it made a sound that I will never forget. It was the sound of my mother's voice calling my name from the other side of the room. My mother lived 3 states away. There was absolutely no way her voice could be in the station's archives. The entity was pulling sounds from somewhere else, maybe from my own head, or maybe from the air itself. "Caleb, honey, look at me," the voice said. It was perfectly clear, devoid of any static. It was coming from the speakers mounted on the wall now, not just the headphones. I backed into the corner of the booth, as far away from the monitors as I could get. I was trapped in a soundproof box with something that could control everything I heard. I closed my eyes and covered my ears, but the sound seemed to vibrate through my very bones. The lights in the booth began to flicker and dim. In the brief flashes of light, I saw the waveforms on the screen change again. They weren't jagged teeth anymore. They were words. Large, blocky text appeared in the editing software, scrolling across the screen like a news ticker. It said, "I like the way you sound when you are afraid. Give me more." At the same moment, a recording of my own screaming, a sound I hadn't even made yet, began to play at a deafening volume. I realized then that the sound collage wasn't just using the past. It was using the future. It was recording me in that very moment, capturing every gasp and every whimper and feeding it back into the mix. I could hear myself crying on the speakers, even though I was trying my best to stay silent. The more noise I made, the more material it had to work with. The entity was building itself a body out of my fear and my voice. In a moment of pure desperation, I remembered that the station had an emergency manual override for the power. It was a physical lever located inside a small metal box near the floor, meant for use during electrical fires. I scrambled across the floor, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the latch. The voices in the room were reaching a fever pitch now, a chaotic storm of words and screams that felt like they were tearing my mind apart. I found the lever and pulled it down with everything I had. The booth went pitch black. The monitors died, the mixing board lights vanished, and the speakers fell into a sudden, agonizing silence. The only thing I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and the distant hiss of the pipes in the basement walls. I sat there in the darkness for what felt like hours, too terrified to move or even breathe. I was afraid that if I made even the slightest sound, the entity would find a way to turn itself back on. Eventually, I felt around for the door handle again. This time, without the electronic lock being powered, it turned easily. I stumbled out into the hallway and ran. I didn't stop until I was outside in the cool night air, standing under the bright security lights of the campus quad. I didn't even go back for my backpack or my keys. I walked all the way back to my dorm, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced that I would hear my own voice calling out to me from the shadows of the trees. I didn't go back to the radio station for 3 days. When I finally worked up the courage to tell my supervisor what had happened, I left out the part about the voices. I told him there had been a massive electrical surge and the computer had fried. He was annoyed, but he didn't seem surprised. He mentioned that the basement of Miller Hall had always had weird grounding issues and that other students had reported hearing things in the booth before. He called it ghost static and laughed it off. I stayed long enough to help him reset the system, but I refused to work the late night shifts anymore. I told him my classes were getting too hard and I needed more time to sleep. He didn't mind, and he hired a freshman to take over my hours. A week later, I was sitting in the student lounge, scrolling through my phone when I received a notification. It was an email from an unknown sender. There was no subject line, just a single attached audio file. My heart sank as I looked at the file name. It was titled Dead Air Collage Final Version MP3. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew I should just delete it and block the sender. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and I felt like I needed to know if it was really over. I took a deep breath, plugged in my earbuds, and hit play. For the first 30 seconds, it was just the lo-fi beats and the old archives I had mixed at the start of that night. It sounded professional and calm. But then the music faded out. The audio became silent, true dead air. And then very softly I heard the sound of a door opening. I heard the sound of my own chair creaking. I heard myself whispering, "Is someone there?" But the voice that answered wasn't my mother's, and it wasn't a collage of old archives. It was a perfect, crystal-clear recording of my own voice, but it was speaking in a way I never would. The recording of me said, "I'm still in the booth, Caleb. I'm just waiting for the next shift to start." I deleted the file immediately and threw my phone across the room. I ended up quitting the job at the station the very next day, and I never stepped foot in the basement of Miller Hall again. Sometimes, when I'm walking across campus late at night and I pass by that building, I can see the faint blue glow of the studio monitors through the small, street-level windows. Even now, years later, I have trouble listening to the radio or using voice-activated assistants like Siri or Alexa. There's always that tiny bit of static in the background of any digital recording, that room tone that people usually ignore. But every time I hear it, I can't help but wonder if something is hiding inside that noise, waiting for enough pieces of my voice to finally finish what it started. I sometimes wonder about the freshman who took my job. I see him around campus occasionally, and he always looks exhausted, with deep dark circles under his eyes. He's always wearing his headphones, even when he's talking to people. I wanted to warn him to tell him to stay away from the archives and to never work in total silence. But then I think about that final audio file, and I realize that maybe it's better if I just stay quiet. After all, the less I say, the less of me there is for it to use.